Montana Territory, June 1883. The wind had teeth that morning, dry and sharp as it moved across the scorched plains and into the hills west of Helena. Ryder Barnes pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge, boots quiet in the stirrups, gaze locked on the crumbling stone chapel tucked in the grove below. He had been tracking a stray calf from his herd, but it was not cattle that made him pause now. It was the woman kneeling alone in the dust and ruin, hands clasped, head bowed beneath the broken crossbeam of the roofless chapel. She looked out of place. Not because of her long skirts or the copper waves pinned tight at her neck, but because of the stillness in her. Everything around her moved, dust, wind, the flutter of her hem, but she stayed steady, praying like the world had not already fallen down around her more than once. Ryder dismounted, leaving his gelding tied quiet beneath a juniper. He stepped over a toppled stone and onto what was left of the chapel's floorboards. They creaked under his weight. The woman turned, startled. Her eyes were wide but not frightened. "I did not hear you," she said, voice soft. "I thought I was alone." "You almost were," Ryder said. "This place has not seen much life in years." "I know. That is why I come here." She stood, brushing her skirt. "But I will go if I am trespassing." "You are not," he said quickly. I have not seen anyone in here before." The woman gave a small nod and looked up at the sky through the broken rafters. "It was a church once. I remember." Ryder stepped forward. "Used to ride past it on the way to town with my father. He said the roof gave out in a storm before the war." "It is quiet here," she said. "I like that." He nodded. "My name is Ryder Barnes. I run cattle out past Rattlesnake Ridge." She hesitated, then nodded. "Keziah, Monroe. I live just north of here. About 5 miles. She did not say more, but Ryder saw it in her, the weight in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself. There was something broken there, something she carried alone. "I did not mean to interrupt your prayer," he said. "You did not," she replied. "I was finished." He looked again at the chapel. "You come here often?" "Most mornings." She glanced down. "I clean a little when I can." "It seems wrong to let it fall more than it already has." Ryder looked at the scattered stones and half-rotted beams. "It is a ruin." "Maybe," she said, "but it was built for hope. I think that is worth saving." He stared at her, not sure what to say to that. She did not sound naive. She sounded like someone who had been through enough to understand how rare hope really was. They walked out together, the grass brushing her skirt and the wind tugging at his coat. When they reached the edge of the grove, he paused. "Do you walk all the way here every day?" "I do. That is a long walk. I do not mind." He looked at her face then, really looked. She was not young in the way girls were, but she was not worn either. She had the kind of quiet beauty that sneaks up on a man. No paint on her cheeks, no ribbons in her hair. Just honesty. "Would you let me ride you home?" Ryder asked. "My horse can carry 2. She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." She climbed up behind him, her arms careful around his waist, not too close. He could feel her breath at his back, steady but guarded. Her home was a small cabin tucked beside a stand of pines. The roof patched in places, the door hung crooked. A little garden fought to live behind a fence of stones. She climbed down and looked up at him. "Thank you for the ride." "I could help with the roof," he said. "If you want." She blinked at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "You were trying to fix the chapel. Seems fair someone helps fix your place too." Keziah looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "All right." He returned the next morning with a hammer, a bag of nails, and a basket of biscuits his sister had made. Keziah met him without a smile, but she took the basket and nodded her thanks. They worked in silence at first. She passed him boards. He hammered. The sun climbed higher. By midday, she had rolled her sleeves and sweat darkened her collar. When he paused to drink from his canteen, she stood beside him, her eyes on the roof. "It was my husband's place," she said quietly. "He died 3 winters ago. Fever." "I am sorry." She nodded. "It was just us and the girls. After he passed, my mother took the children back east. Said I needed time." Ryder looked at her. "You let them go?" "I did not want to. But my youngest Brielle, she was always sick. I could not get the medicine she needed out here. He could hear the pain in her voice even though she tried to hide it. She is better now, Keziah said. My mother writes, but she will not let them return. That is not right. No, she said, but I do not have much say. He watched her then, the way her hands twisted in her skirt, how her jaw clenched like she did not even want to speak of it. Maybe, he said slowly, we could fix more than the roof. What do you mean? He looked back toward the hills. If we rebuild the chapel, if the town sees someone cares for it again, maybe it becomes something more. Maybe it becomes a reason. A reason for what? For folks to gather. For your girls to come home. For you to start again. She stared at him like she did not know whether to believe him. You would do that? I would. Why? Ryder met her eyes. Because I think you deserve that kind of hope. For the first time she smiled. It was small but real. That afternoon they rode back to the chapel. The floor was half rotted. The pews were gone. The altar was a pile of stone. But Keziah stood in the center of it and looked around like she could already see it whole. I will help, Ryder said. She turned to him. Then we begin tomorrow. He nodded once. We will get it back. And he meant more than the chapel. The next morning the sun came slow over the ridge, casting long gold stripes across the frost-laced grass. Ryder arrived before Keziah, the silence of the grove pressing gentle around him. He set down the oilskin bundle he'd brought, fresh rope, a whetstone, a hand-forged chisel, and walked the chapel's perimeter, boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp ground where the creek had risen in spring. When Keziah appeared between the trees, she was carrying a small wooden box with a broken leather hinge. She tied her apron back, sleeves rolled, hair braided down her back instead of pinned. Her pace was steady, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the stonework like she'd spent the night memorizing where each piece belonged. I brought my father's tools, she said, setting the box beside the altar stones. He was a mason before he took to farming. Ryder crouched beside it. The chisel edges were worn, handles darkened with use. One still had dried mortar clinging to the base. He picked it up, tested the weight in his hand. They'll do, he said. Better than what I brought. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she knelt and began clearing away the brittle moss growing between the foundation stones. Ryder joined her, and they worked without speech for a time, the rustle of pine needles and the scrape of metal against stone the only sounds. When the cornerstones were cleared, Keziah sat back on her heels and brushed her hands against her skirt. I used to watch him build, she said, I still on the wall. He never rushed. Said a house will fall if you lay one stone out of pride. Ryder leaned on his knee. He sounds like someone who knew what mattered. He did. Until the soil turned against him and he couldn't feed us. She paused. He died before the war ended. Ryder didn't ask how. The way she said it held a finality that needed no explanation. Instead, he said, we can use the creek mud to reseat these. It'll hold if we pack it right. She nodded, wiping her palms on a cloth square she'd tucked into her waistband. By midday, they'd reset 4 of the fallen stones. Ryder's shoulders ached, and a cut along his wrist bled slow from where a shard had caught him. Keziah reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded linen strip. Hold still, she said, taking his wrist. Her fingers were warm from the sun, but her touch was careful, practiced. She wound the cloth twice, tied it without looking up. You've done that before, Ryder said. My eldest fell on a nail once. I had to stitch it closed with thread meant for mending socks. He looked at her, then. Did you always know how to manage on your own? No, she said. But I had to learn fast. They ate beneath the bent pine at the edge of the grove, sharing cold beans wrapped in oilcloth and a heel of cornbread Keziah had tucked in her basket. Ryder didn't speak while she ate, noting how she chewed slow, like she was used to making small meals last. Afterward, she stood and walked to the chapel's far corner where the altar stones lay in a heap. She crouched beside the largest and ran her hand over the carving on its face, weathered but still visible. A single star above a wheat sheaf. Did you ever believe? She asked, not looking back. Ryder stood behind her, arms crossed. In God. In anything. He was quiet a moment. When I was 16, I rode north to find a mare that had broken loose. A storm rolled in fast, and I lost the trail. Spent the night under an outcrop with nothing but a wet coat and a broken lantern. I prayed the whole night through. She turned slightly, her brows raised. I didn't know what I was praying to, he said. But I figured if something could bring the sun back, I owed it a little faith. She gave a small breath of a laugh. Did the mare turn up? 3 days later. She walked into the yard like she never left. Keziah shook her head. Maybe she was the answer. Maybe. That evening when Ryder offered to ride her home again, she declined. I'd rather walk today, she said, adjusting the strap of her empty basket. The quiet helps me think. He didn't press. Instead, he walked beside her until the grove opened into the fields. The wind had shifted, blowing warm now, and the light slanted soft across her face. You're not what I expected, she said suddenly. He glanced at her. What did you expect? Someone who'd see a ruin and keep riding. He looked ahead. Maybe I would've. Before. Before what? He didn't answer. When they reached the fork in the trail, she stopped. You don't have to come tomorrow. I know. But will you? Ryder nodded once. She held his gaze a second longer, then turned and walked the rest of the way alone, her silhouette folding into the trees as the last of the sunlight bled away behind her. Back at the chapel, Ryder sat on the stone step with the chisel still warm in his hand. He didn't pray, but he stayed until the stars came out, listening to the wind move through the timbers like a voice just out of reach. The sound of hammering carried through the trees before Keziah reached the grove. She found Ryder high on the frame of the south wall, shirt sleeves rolled, his shoulders shifting with the rhythm of each strike. A new beam lay across the top edge, freshly cut, notched clean at the joints. The scent of pine resin and sweat mingled in the morning air. You started without me, she said, stepping into the open. I couldn't sleep, he replied without looking down. Figure this beam wouldn't lift itself. She set her satchel beside the altar stones and shaded her eyes to watch him. Where'd you get timber that straight? Traded a steer to a man up near the basin. He'd milled a few extra lengths ahead of winter. You traded livestock for this? I didn't say it was the best steer. He climbed down, wiping his hands on a scrap of canvas. Keziah opened the satchel and pulled out a wrapped bundle. I brought something. He raised an eyebrow. Curtains, she said, unfolding the fabric. Or they will be. The windows will need something once we finish them. He took one, ran his thumb over the edge. This is linen. My mother kept bolts in a chest. She said they were for special days. She folded the fabric again. I figured it's time they saw light. Ryder nodded, then motioned toward the frame. Want to help with the brace? She joined him at the eastern wall, and together they lifted the crossbeam into place. Her breath was steady beside his, hands firm but careful. When they stepped back, the frame stood taller, the shape of a roof beginning to emerge. She leaned on the post, brushing sawdust from her palm. Did you ever think you'd end up doing this? He shook his head. I thought I'd die on a cattle trail before I turned 30. She glanced sideways at him. And now? I think I'd rather build something that lasts longer than I do. They worked until the sun crested high, then paused beneath the chapel's growing shadow. Keziah opened a jar of pickled carrots, passing it to him without a word. He took a few, chewing thoughtfully. Your hands hardened, he said, nodding toward the calluses at her knuckles. You trying to say I'm no lady? I think you're more woman than most men know what to do with. She didn't answer, but her lips pressed together like she was holding down a smile she didn't want to show. Later, as they fitted the first pane of glass into the new window frame, Keziah's voice broke the quiet. I had a dream last night, she said, steadying the frame while he secured the trim. I was standing in this chapel and it was whole. There were candles burning and my daughters were there. They were wearing blue ribbons. He looked at her. Was it a memory? No, she said softly. But I wish it had been. He tapped the last nail in place, then sat back. Maybe it will be. She didn't reply, but her hands lingered on the window frame, fingertips tracing the edge. That evening, he walked her back again, not because she asked, but because he wanted to. The trail was quiet, the light drawn thin by the cloud banks settling over the western hills. When they reached her gate, she paused with her hand on the latch. You never asked why I stayed, she said. I figured it wasn't my place. I had nowhere else to go. But I stayed because I didn't want to be someone who just left. I didn't want my girls to grow up thinking that's what you do when life splits open. He watched her. The way her voice didn't tremble even though her hands did. You didn't leave, he said. That means something. She stepped inside her yard, then turned. You're a quiet man, Ryder Barnes. He rubbed the back of his neck. Not sure there's much worth saying most days. There is, she said. You just wait till it matters. He stood there long after she'd gone inside, the low flicker of her hearth fire catching in the window glass. Behind him, the woods rustled with night wind, and the faint creak of saddle leather reminded him of every trail he'd ever ridden alone. But he didn't feel alone now. Not anymore. The summer deepened, and with it the chapel's bones grew stronger. The roofline had taken shape beneath Ryder's measured hand, and Keziah had begun painting the lintels white with a stub of brush and a tin of lime wash she'd bartered off a traveling peddler. The air was thick with heat now, the kind that made the pine needles curl and the soil crackle underfoot, but neither of them seemed to mind. They came each day as if drawn by something older than obligation. On the 6th morning after the frame had gone up, Ryder brought a small crate beneath one arm, balanced carefully beside the tools. He set it down at the edge of the chapel's clearing without a word, but Keziah noticed the way he avoided looking at her until she asked, "What's in the box?" He nudged it open with the toe of his boot. Inside lay a handful of books, worn at the edges, their covers faded. One had a corner chewed off, another had a page mended with string. But the titles were legible scripture, psalms, and beside them, a hymnal with the spine barely holding. "They were my mother's," he said. "I found them in the loft above the barn." Thought maybe they belonged here more than there. Keziah crouched beside the crate. "She taught you to read with these?" He nodded, fingers tightening slightly around the handle of his hammer. She read aloud when Pa was gone on drives. Her voice carried through the walls like it was made of something stronger than flesh. She lifted the hymnal and opened to the first page. A name was scrawled in uneven ink, M. Barnes. She wrote in it. Not often. Just her name. She said it made her feel like she belonged in the words. Keziah closed the book gently and set it aside. "We'll build a shelf. Keep them dry. Already milled the lumber." Later, while they worked on the interior beams, Keziah cut her thumb deep on a splintered edge. She didn't cry out, just hissed through her teeth and clamped her other hand around it. Blood ran down her wrist. Ryder reached for his kerchief, but she waved him off and stepped outside. He followed anyway, catching up as she knelt by the creek, washing the wound in the cold water. "You shouldn't let it bleed out that long," he said. "My father used to say it cleaned the bad out. Your father's not here." She glanced over her shoulder. "And you are." He crouched beside her, took her hand gently, and wrapped the cloth around it. His fingers brushed hers just once, but she didn't pull away. "Most men I've known didn't care if I bled," she said. "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed. "You're not." They stayed there by the edge of the water until the shadows lengthened. The hush between them wasn't heavy. It was the kind that settled when words had done what they needed to, and both people knew it. When they returned to the chapel, Ryder stopped just short of the frame. "I've been asked to speak in town next week," he said. Keziah turned, surprised. "You don't seem like the type." "I'm not. They want someone to say a few words at the harvest gathering. About rebuilding. About hope." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I told them no." "Why?" "I didn't think I had something worth saying." She stepped closer. "You're wrong." He looked at her then, not like a man uncertain, but like one seeing something take shape he hadn't dared imagine before. Her hair had come loose in the wind, and a streak of lime wash marked her sleeve, but her eyes were clear. "I could say something," he said slowly, "if you were there. I don't belong to that town anymore. You belong to this chapel." She didn't answer right away, but her gaze swept the beams, the joints, the window frame catching the last of the light. "If I come, it won't be for the town." "I know." That night he didn't walk her home. She stayed behind after he left, lighting a stub of candle and setting it on the altar stone. The flame flickered in the draft, but it held. She sat on the floor, the old hymnal in her lap, and for the first time in years, sang aloud. Her voice was quiet, uncertain at first, but it filled the space like it had been waiting for that very sound. Miles away, Ryder sat on the edge of his bunk, pen in hand. He hadn't written anything since his sister's wedding, and even then, it had been only a few lines. But now he scratched words onto the page short, plain. About timber, about stone, and the way a woman's voice could carry through broken walls and make something whole again. The harvest gathering came on a pale-skied Thursday, the kind of day where the air held the memory of summer but the light had already turned toward autumn. Ryder stood near the edge of the town square, boots freshly polished, his shirt pressed with care. The chapel still waited in the grove, unfinished but proud, its rafters framed against the sky like outstretched arms. He'd come early, not to speak first, but to see if she would come. Keziah arrived just before the cider barrels were tapped, wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, dark green, with stitching at the cuffs that caught the light. Her braid was pinned higher than usual, and she carried herself like a woman who had decided something and meant to see it through. She found him near the wagon stacked with pumpkins and nodded once. "You're going to speak?" "I am." "Are you ready?" "Not in the way that matters," he said. "But I'll do it anyway." She stepped closer. "Then I'll stand with you." When the town's deputy called for quiet, Ryder moved to the small platform they'd thrown together from hay bales and planks. He held a sheet of paper in one hand, but his eyes searched only for her in the crowd. She stood near the front, her arms folded loosely, her gaze steady. "I was asked to talk about rebuilding," he said, voice low but clear. "And I thought I'd speak about wood, nails, labor. But none of that's worth much without saying this first. Nothing gets built if you don't believe it should stand." The wind tugged at the corner of his paper, but he ignored it. "There's an old chapel out past the creek. Most folks let it rot. I nearly did myself, but someone else didn't." She stood inside what was broken and saw what it could be. "And because of that, it's standing again." He paused, let the silence settle. "I don't know much about sermons, but I know what it means to find someone who carries more than you can see and still chooses to stay. That's worth rebuilding for." When he stepped down, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The quiet had weight, and in it was respect. Keziah met him halfway, her hand brushing his as they passed through the crowd. She didn't speak until they were beyond the tents and the sound of fiddle strings. "I've never seen you afraid," she said. "I wasn't afraid to speak," he replied. "I was afraid you wouldn't be there." She reached for his hand again, this time not letting go. "You don't have to be afraid of that." They returned to the chapel the next morning, and the work moved faster now. Word had spread, and a few neighbors came with boards and baskets of nails. A boy from the mill brought hinges. An older woman brought a pot of lye soap and scrubbed the altar stone until the star and wheat carving shone again. But Keziah and Ryder said little. They worked side by side, never out of step. By mid-October, the chapel was whole. The roof held strong against the wind, and the windows caught the morning light like open eyes. The inside smelled of cut wood and beeswax. On the final day, Keziah hung the curtains she had sewn, each stitch even, the hem straight. Ryder stood in the doorway watching her smooth the fabric. "You ever think it'd look like this?" he asked. "I hoped it would." He crossed the room and took her hand. "I want to ask something." She turned toward him. "All right? I don't want to ride back to an empty house anymore." Keziah's eyes didn't waver. "And I don't want to wake alone." He stepped closer. "Then stay with me. Let's build something that doesn't fall in storms." She reached up, her hand against his jaw. "Yes." They married a week later in the very chapel they'd rebuilt. No preacher from Helena came, just the schoolteacher, who'd once read sermons before the war, and a circle of neighbors who bore witness. Keziah wore no veil, only a ribbon the color of the sky at dusk. Ryder wore his father's vest. When they spoke their vows, they did so with hands clasped, eyes steady, no promises of perfection, only of staying. The town brought food, and the children tied wildflowers to the fence posts. Keziah's daughters arrived 2 days later, brought west by her uncle who'd never stopped writing on her behalf. The girls stepped into the chapel like they remembered it, though they'd never seen it whole. Keziah knelt to greet them, tears running freely down her cheeks. Ryder stood back, his throat thick, and waited until they came to him. The younger one reached for his hand first. That winter, their home grew warmer than the hearth could explain. The girls filled the rooms with laughter, and Keziah's voice returned to singing as she cooked. Ryder built a cradle for the baby they hoped would come. The chapel stayed open year-round, not for sermons, but for stillness. People came to sit in the quiet, to remember what could be mended. Years passed. The curtains faded. The hymnals wore soft at the corners. But the beams held, and so did they. On their porch, every evening after supper, Keziah leaned her head against Ryder's shoulder. He would lace his fingers through hers, and neither of them needed to speak. They had already said everything in the way they lived, and the chapel, once broken, stood taller than ever, lit golden in the last light, a quiet testament to the way two people can rebuild the world around them stone by stone, hand in hand.